Welcome to Leaders Upgraded, the place where people who want to upgrade and fast track their career, their life, and their leadership journey tend to gather. I am your host, Tanvi Gautam, and I shall be speaking to the top 10% of the world's leading authors, CEOs, coaches, and thinkers to bring you some of the best and brilliant ideas to fast track your way to success. Would you like an upgrade? Let's do this.
The future is not created, it's co-created, says our next guest, Nilofer, who is the winner of Thinkers 50 Future Thinkers Award. She's a TED speaker. She is a regular columnist with Harvard Business Review, Time, 2 times author, and a new column on onlyness, a topic that we're going to be talking about today. She's also been an entrepreneur and a consultant, but more than anything else, the thing that strikes me about Nilofer is that despite all her successes and her incredible life story, if you ever listen to Nilofer talking, you will find a level of authenticity and connection that is often missing from people who reach the heights that she has. So I'm greatly looking forward to our conversation today, and it's an honor to have her on this show. I was reading some work on the fact that organizations deal with 2 types of changes, the adaptive changes and then the technical changes. And what is happening in organizations is that we are trying to throw technical solutions at adaptive problems. We're trying to throw, technology at an adaptive problem, which is that we need to reconnect with the humanity in the workplace. And we think we're going to do that by adopting some technology solution. And so that's not really going to happen, right? I agree. And so, while reading the book, so we talk about how in the 1700s value was around, the machines. In the 1900s, it was resources like fossil fuels. In the 60s, we were talking financial leverage. And now we're in the social era where the point of value creation is the connected human. So tell us a little bit about this concept of onlyness. How are you defining it? And why does it matter?
Why use that word? So I'll do first the definition and then why and how I came to the word. So the definition of onlyness, each of us is standing in a spot in the world only you're standing in. It's a function of your history and experiences, visions and hopes. So it is both the past and what has made you who you are, including even those things sometimes you don't like about that. Maybe some tough experiences you've had or things that you wish you could have done. It is all of that and what it is you imagine for the world. So it is both present and future state. And the reason I named it onlyness, I was looking for words. In fact, I was working with my editor over at Harvard because I wrote about it in my second book, Social Era. And Sarah Green is my editor there. She's amazingly talented. And we were going back and forth. And I said, well, it's not talent because when Jim Collins coined the term get the right people on the bus, he was talking about credentialed, degreed people. He had a bunch of qualifiers to it. So how do you know if someone is talented? Well, you can look at their resume and you can see what schools they went to and blah, blah, blah. And I'm actually suggesting it can be inherent talent, not credential talent. So that word didn't seem to apply. I also struggled with words like uniqueness. Uniqueness can be so relative. So I could be or you could be the only woman in a corporate boardroom, for example, and be told you are unique. And I remind people that women represent 52% of the US population and 51% globally. So really being a woman is actually one of the least interesting things about me or you or most women. It's usually far more specific why we can add value at the table. In my case, I've shipped over 100 products in my career, netting over $18 billion worth of revenue. So that's probably where my corporate board experience is going to, lean on. So unique seemed too relative. And so Sarah and I were going back and forth because we were really I wasn't trying to coin a new term. I usually make fun of people who coin new terms, but we couldn't find anything. And both of us had been people who had been the quote unquote only in different situations, and that had always been a negative. So if you were the only woman in that corporate boardroom, it often felt lonely. And yet the thing that we were bringing to the table was a strength. And so we were just talking that through, and finally it occurred to me that this thing that has been devalued for literally hundreds of years because you don't fit into the larger majority narrative is actually the greatest position of strength. And so that's why the term onlyness, to reclaim that thing that only you can bring as not a liability, but a strength.
Connections that were not necessarily possible even a decade ago. I think a lot of voices from the margins are emerging, which allow us to see that the mainstream narrative is not the only narrative, that there is a lot of individuality available, and that we've never really considered it because the mainstream conversation has been.
So one of the pieces of research I found in writing the book, and so it'll be in there in more specificity, is how much this quote unquote marginality is actually a real position of strength. So Kareem Lakhani and another professor have just finished a piece of research across the healthcare space. Kareem is a Harvard professor, and they studied 166 pieces of research across the healthcare space with 12,000 different outcomes. So individually, specifically new outcomes. And they found that 100% of those results, so that where did the original idea come from that created the solution across 166 different pieces of research, they all came from marginal players. And marginal players could be the truly young person, who shouldn't have the experience to have that answer. It could be the woman. In fact, their research actually showed it was a very dominant set of players who were women who were considered marginal in their field. And so I don't like the word marginal because it's relative, again, to the majority. And so why the term onlyness is to celebrate that thing only you can bring. So I understand Kareem's usage of the term marginal, and I'm just, stating more specifically where it comes from, which is each of us have our own source of creativity and ideas and therefore innovation. And unless we allow those to show up at the table, not only are people individually not able to express themselves, which is important, but the economy loses, the innovation marketplace loses, and therefore we all lose.
I agree. I think there is a business imperative to onlyness that a lot of people will need to grasp. And you were talking earlier about how people rely on credentials and degrees and what firms have you worked at and all of that to try and assess talent and how valuable you are, so to speak. And you've talked about that uncovering inherent talent rather than relying on these assigned credentials is the key to unlocking value in organizations. I conceptually get it. I'm all for it. I think, my favorite thing to say when I'm talking to at HR conferences, I said, you guys would have probably rejected Steve Jobs. Why? Because he had a break in the resume. He went and sat for some, couple of years in the ashram or somewhere in India, I believe. And that would be a nonlinear career, and you can't comprehend this idea of a nonlinear career. And so, you probably would have tossed his resume because he doesn't fit that criteria. So I was curious to hear, in your experience, do you think that organizations are ready for this approach?
Right now, is a guy who actually built a connected network of 300 or so players who could build off each other. And he said the very first moment when they all get together, he actually makes sure he doesn't introduce them by what they've done, even though they've all done amazing things, but what he finds really interesting about them. And some of those stories are not necessarily super pretty packaged stories. They're the ashram stories. They're the funkinesses of each other. And he does that for an entire day where he introduces them to each other in this more, what I'll call, unconventional way. And the reason I found the story so interesting is because of what the people who were in the room said about it. They said, for the first time, instead of even seeing myself by what I'd done, or more importantly, what I hadn't done, because there's sometimes the dialogue we're having inside our own heads, like we're going, oh, Tanvi's done so many interesting things. She's lived in Australia and in Singapore, and I've only lived in France, right? Like I could easily do a comparisonitis symptom. And instead, I could go, wow, tell me more about what drew you to Singapore and why you find that so interesting, right? So if it comes from a position of being super curious and interested in who you are and self-accepting about who I am, then all of a sudden we're going to work together in a very different way. And so this guy sets up this leadership construct where he basically says, I refuse to let you introduce yourself by your accomplishments or your titles or your rank. What I want to do is get you guys to see each other in terms of what you each distinctly bring. And I think that takes so much courage on his part to even try to create that construct. And then when I listened to because there's 300 participants in the thing, so I asked them a series of questions, and they said, no one's ever introduced me that way before. And I just imagine taking back that to the work context. Okay, so how many of us in our HR world introduce us by 12 years of experience in this particular title and that? And instead of saying, here's this really interesting story about this person and why I think they're going to be such an interesting addition to our team.
I think, see, language tells us so much, right? When you say human resources, the moment you've already called it a resource, your view of the person is completely different. My favorite way of talking about this is I often tell people, I said, one of these days, I'm going to stop going to conferences and asking people, so what do you do? I think I'm just going to just introduce myself and then say, so why are you doing what you're doing? Because I think that would be a supremely more interesting conversation.
And so, like, one good fun question could be, what are you passionate about? But maybe that's too high of a ceiling. So what brought you here, right? But there's all sorts of other ways of having that conversation instead of title.
Are the ideas of onlyness and personal branding, are they related or are they in opposition? Are they building off of each other? How do you juxtapose these ideas of onlyness and personal branding?
So I'll give you first my understanding of brand and how I've come to understand it. So if you remember back in the 80s, Tom Peters wrote a piece. It was in Fast Company. It basically made Fast Company as a magazine called The Brand Called You. And it was one of those pieces I read, it was just at the height, like the moment where my career was finally coming together. And so I read this piece and it made a great deal of sense. But if you actually go back and read it now, you'll notice he's pointing to the individuation of power, which is definitely what onlyness is. But because of the language of the 80s and how much Procter & Gamble and so many other companies were setting the agenda, he positioned it, I think, unfortunately, in the language of marketing. And I think I say unfortunately because I think he's talking more to the truth of who the person is, not quote unquote just how you brand it. And so I think of brand much more, how many years has it been? So 30 years later after reading that piece, my gosh, I think of brand as being the exhaust fume of the engine of your life. If you do enough stuff, the stuff you're interested in, the exhaust fume largely takes care of itself. I'm not trying to simplify that because there's some work to be done to make sure it's clear, but it should be a product to capture the essence of who you are. Now, so I think about brand as being a subset of onlyness, meaning I cannot prove to you, for example, right now, if I said to you, my brand is to be the policy person around how people are valued in the economy. Let's just say I said that was my brand. There's no evidence, by the way, that is actually true because I could not prove that to you. But it is my vision for the world. It is my vision for, I think we've largely been viewing human beings as this capital asset, right? And I think we need to actually have a different set of policies and infrastructure that allow people to be valued quite differently. And I could imagine 10, 15 years from now actually helping drive policies for countries or regions to do that. And but that is more my hope or vision than it is something I've done. So my onlyness includes that, but it's not my brand, right? Because I haven't done it yet. So I kind of think about, if I was drawing like a Venn diagram, I'm totally an econ person, so I think this way. If I drew a Venn diagram, onlyness would be the thing that is all of you, and some of that is stuff that you've now materialized, and some of that within that Venn diagram would be and then this would be the way in which I might package that up, so it's brand.
So it sounds to me onlyness is probably closer to the authenticity conversation than it is to the personal branding conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's who you are, and who you are has to include your full story, your through line, even the future through line. So I'm owning that part that is always in creative context and moving forward. And the reason I'm doing that is because it's what's actually going to shape you, right? If you think about what's pulling you into the future, it's some idea that you have for what the world could or should be, even if it doesn't exist in the world today.
So share with us, if you will. You've looked at so many stories for your book. Is there one that is particularly close to your heart that you could share with us?
I'll tell you one story that showed up in the book. It's early on, and I've talked about it at South by, so I'll share it here. So there's a person named Kimberly Bryant who runs something called Black Girls Code, and she started this program having, interestingly enough, gone to college in a place where she experienced social uprising. Actually helped her university divest in South Africa to help drive policy reform for South Africa. So she had this very strong rebellious nature. She'd gone and worked inside major companies, but as her daughter was growing up, she dropped her off at a coding camp one day and realizes that her daughter is the only Black girl in the program. So she comes home and she thinks, I should figure out how to fund 4 other kids to go with her. And, sort of like subsidize 4 other kids to go so that my kid's not the only one. And finally, it occurs to her the same problem that she grew up with her mom, and the generation before that. Everyone was focused on like solving the problem for that one person. Like, if I help you, Tanvi, succeed, then we will have helped women in education, or women. We will have helped change the ratio. And actually, that doesn't actually change the ratio. What it does is it gets one person to be successful, but quite often we're the only one. So we end up in a situation where we end up adapting to society's norms, not being able to change society's norms. And so Kim had this insight that if she was actually going to change society, she needed to build a cohort of people who understood how to work together. And so she's now built a program that she hopes to have 1 million kids go through the program. She's at, what was the number as of recently? It was like 80,000 or 100,000 or something. It was a good size number. Young women, young girls who have gone through the program. And she's scaling it up with other mothers who are helping mobilize in their local cities the same curriculum and creating the scale. So it is embodying the idea of onlyness. So someone's story, then you find people like you, so like other moms who care about the same things, and then you galvanize action in a very specific way, so you create a dent in the world. So to me, I love that story because it follows the thesis all the way through.
Very interesting. This bit about when you found yourself in your onlyness and then you chose to adapt rather than to honor it. So, the way I see it is there are 2 challenges at hand. The first is finding our onlyness. A lot of us go through life without being aware of what that onlyness is about, because there are parts of our story that we might deny, or the parts of our story that we don't acknowledge or recognize for whatever reason, sometimes good, sometimes bad. So uncovering that onlyness is one part. But the other part is, how do we link it to the worthiness conversation, right? And say that, yes, this is my onlyness, and I step into it, and I own it, and it is worthy. I'm a huge follower of Brené Brown's work. It's changed the way I look at my own life. And so the whole vulnerability piece has been very important to my work as well. And I see those threads in yours. So if I was to ask you, how do I not just claim my onlyness, but how do I link it to the worthiness piece?
Sure. It's absolutely linked. It's absolutely linked. You're drawing exactly the right inference. So here's the thing. If you cannot accept your own self as it is, imperfect as we are, each and every single one of us, if you cannot accept that, then you'll never actually celebrate your onlyness. Because what you're doing more often than not is then you say, well, I'm not good enough because, and then fill in the blank. And I'll tell you some of the ones I've done just to give you some examples, not meant to be exhaustive, of course. But for example, I never got to go to a 4-year university because I worked my way through school. I didn't have family support. And I think it took me 15 years. I could probably do the math on that. It might be 16 years to go through all my different degrees. I went to schools that are not as notable as others because they were the ones who had working school programs. So I didn't have to quit my job. So I could actually afford to fund it and not go into debt. And I literally would be like, $2 goes to school, $1 goes to live, kind of, like whatever it was. I was always juggling that. I worked at a company, for example, and didn't leave until I made sure I was done with school. They would fund it, So I was all those set of trade-offs. And yet, if someone asks me, and this happens on a regular basis because I do write quite a bit for Harvard, people say, "Oh, you must have gone to Harvard." And I go, "No, no, no, I didn't." But a part of me always has this this little voice which says, "Oh, I wish I had," right? Because there's a mythology in my heart about what that could mean, what kind of people I might have met, what kind of maybe experience that would have come from that, what new kind of opportunities might have come from there. And what that would not be doing is celebrating what actually happened, which is I went to a Jesuit institution for graduate work. I worked my way through school, which meant, by the way, I applied every idea the next day because that was just how the program sort of lent itself. I studied in a very different way because I was really focused on what would it mean to actually do this stuff. I'm probably one of the best people at translating a big idea into reality because that's just kind of how I taught myself school. And if I was worried about being the 4-year person at Harvard, then I wouldn't be celebrating the thing that is already true to me. And I think we do that because, like, if you look at who's on the, I don't know, pick the latest list. Fortune just finished their 50 most powerful business list. I didn't check this, but I could practically guarantee without checking it that every single one of those people went to a major institution in the top 10. And I would think, well, man, I'm never going to make it to that list, right? That could be the conversation I'm having with myself instead of celebrating the thing that is you and working from that. Because the thing is, the dominant narrative is going to get us exactly what we're doing today over again. And why I'm saying onlyness matters is I think there's a bunch of the world's problems we haven't solved yet because we're not looking at it in a new and fresh way. So what is the thing that someone like me might see or ask or probe on just based on that one difference? And I could add to those, just like you could, right? Your life story being unique to you and your visions and hopes being unique to you, then you draw on a different set of strengths.
So as we kind of wrap up, what do you think would be your advice to someone who's been listening in and saying, yeah, I think it's time to step into my onlyness? Where would you suggest they begin this journey? Have you some thoughts on how they might end up going about it? Do you have any recommendations there?
Sure. So there's two things. So let's just take it down a bifurcated road. So the first one is if you work inside an organization and you see something that you want to ask more questions on or you disagree with or whatever, I want to give you the permission that you need. Give yourself permission to ask those questions and to speak up. And the data consistently proves that even if you're wrong, so even if your opinion is wrong, you will improve the performance of that team by asking that next question that you have by 30%. That's even if you're wrong. Now, what if you're right? Now you can influence it even more. And so learning how and when to speak up is just a skill every single one of us needs to have, even when we don't think it'll be welcomed. We just have to figure out how to still do it. So that's the first piece. If you're within an organization, learn how to own that original, even if it's just a niggling feeling, because that's where it starts first, to say, that doesn't make sense. I don't understand that. Or could we do it this other way? Find ways to express it. That's the first thing. The second is if you're a solopreneur, a freelancer, an entrepreneur, all the different ways in which we're more independent of organizational constructs, I want you to actually take a different strategy because you're already probably listening to yourself if you're doing that because you're probably running your own ideas economy in your own world. Your challenge is going to be figuring out how to create scale. And so you need to go find the people who are like you. That could be interest groups. It could be, I call it guilds, right? What are all the different communities where if there are other writers, then go find those people. If you are a solopreneur, go find YPO, like find ways to build community because that is the way in which you will actually build a network to create scale around an idea. Not necessarily just by growing your own organization, but finding the other people who will feed your ideas, build on them, maybe figure out how to actually get them out in the marketplace faster and bigger than you would all by yourself. And those are the two things, because onlyness is the genesis. But if no one ever hears it and you don't create scale with other people, then the idea dies on them.
Thank you not just for being on the show, but for being who you are and for all that you do to bring the tribe together. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for tuning into the podcast. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did and you were able to take away some ideas to start using in your own career as well as your leadership journey. To keep up with us, that concludes this episode of Leaders Upgraded. But wait, your journey is just getting started. Go to www.leadersupgraded.com for more insights, more inspiration, and more tools to continue the journey. And if you like this episode, please do share it. Please do subscribe to the podcast. And I look forward to continued upgrades with you. Take care.